Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps.
Okay, so you want to get up to speed on the government's whole COVID-19 response, right? But nobody wants to wade through hundreds of pages of dense reports.
Definitely not. It's a huge time sink.
That's where we come in. We've done the deep dive for you into this SSCP Final Report NNS.PDF. It's a big one.
Huge. It covers, well, almost everything.
Yeah, vaccine decisions, economic impacts, even the whole origins debate. Our goal here is basically to pull out the really key stuff, the surprising bits, so you get the picture without getting totally overwhelmed.
And it's based on a real mix of sources, too.
Right. Government docs, emails, hearing transcripts, published papers. It's all in there.
Exactly. We're trying to sort of distill it down to the main arguments and conclusions.
Okay, so the report kind of kicks off with a statement from Chairman Wenstrup. And the first thing he hits on is this feeling of, well, distrust in leadership during the pandemic.
That seems foundational.
Yeah, he argues that to get that trust back for, future crises, we absolutely need accountability, transparency, honesty, integrity, all that good stuff.
Makes sense.
The idea is that any big national response has to be managed just for the public good, no personal agendas, no bias. Seems like a fair starting point.
It really does. Wenstrup is basically saying trust is everything. If that's broken, the whole response suffers.
And the report suggests the pandemic really showed some cracks there.
Yeah, and fixing those is critical for next time. That impartiality piece is key. Decisions need to look like they're based on evidence, not politics.
Okay, now diving into vaccine decisions, this was a big focus. The report talks about the Biden administration's push for boosters for everyone.
Right, the universal booster availability.
And apparently the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, she actually overruled her own expert advisory committee, the ACIP.
Which is unusual. The ACIP are the independent experts who weigh the evidence.
Exactly. And the report, well, it suggests this overruling might have been to meet President Biden's kind of public goals for vaccine timelines.
Ah, okay. So potentially political pressure influencing a scientific recommendation.
That's the implication. It raises that question about the tension between political aims and, purely scientific advice. What's really driving the bus?
It's a classic challenge in public health, unfortunately. The ACIP's whole purpose is objective advice. If that gets overridden for what looks like political reasons,
Yeah, it shakes confidence in the whole process.
definitely questions the independence of the agencies.
And sticking with vaccine safety, always huge. The report looks hard at VAERS, the reporting system for adverse events.
The vaccine adverse event reporting system, yeah.
And it finds some pretty big limitations, a lack of transparency, like how is this data actually used, what follow-up happens. The worry, basically, is that important safety signals might be getting missed, especially things like neurological conditions.
That's a significant concern. VAERS is useful, but it's passive. It likely captures only a fraction of what really happens.
And the CDC started a new system too, right, for COVID vaccines specifically.
It did, yeah. But the report says there were transparency issues with that data as well. Kind of a theme emerging.
It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How complete is our picture of vaccine safety?
Well, the report highlights testimony, like from Dr. Whelan, saying VAERS isn't really building trust because the updates aren't public. There's no proactive follow-up seen by the public.
Right. If people don't see a clear process, they get skeptical.
Understandably so.
Okay, so that leads to another interesting angle, the doctor-patient relationship.
Ah, yes.
The report argues that using existing drugs for off-label purposes, for conditions they weren't initially approved for, it says that was unjustly demonized.
So discouraging doctors from using their judgment?
Kind of. And the report suggests this actually hurt the trust between doctors and patients. It limited options, maybe.
It potentially undermines the doctor's role in tailoring treatment. And it wasn't just off-label use, right?
No, exactly. Dr. Singer's testimony is mentioned too, saying the vaccine mandates also strained that relationship
How so?
by sort of overriding patient autonomy, going against what some patients felt was right for them, impacting trust again.
Right, that idea of mandates being an intrusion on that very personal doctor-patient space where individualized advice is key.
Okay, let's shift to the economy. Because, wow, the pandemic really shook things up there.
Massively.
The report suggests that some public health measures, it calls them arbitrary and overly broad, And also the way scientific debate was maybe suppressed, that these things actually made unemployment worse.
So unintended economic consequences from the health response itself.
That's the argument. It points particularly to lower wage workers, service industries being hit hardest and, still facing higher unemployment.
Which we definitely saw play out.
Of course, it also notes that things like remote work, e-commerce, automation, those trends massively accelerated too, adding to the disruption.
Absolutely. It's a complex picture. The report argues some interventions might have disproportionately harmed vulnerable sectors, alongside those broader economic shifts.
Okay, now we get into the really debated territory. Where did COVID-19 actually come from?
The origin story. Always contentious.
The report lays out both main theories. The lab leak idea and the zoonotic or natural jump from animals.
Standard contenders.
It talks about that famous paper, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which, initially came down strongly against a lab origin.
All right, that was very influential early on.
But here's the twist in the report. It includes emails, testimony, suggesting some authors of that very paper felt pressured.
Pressured? By whom?
Possibly figures like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins. The suggestion is they were pushed to downplay the lab possibility.
Wow, okay. That's a serious claim.
And apparently early on, even among those scientists, there were discussions about weird features of the virus's genetic code.
Like the furin cleavage site.
Exactly. That and the receptor binding domain, things that looked, maybe a bit unusual. Some experts apparently thought, hey, could this be engineered?
So the internal scientific conversation might have been more nuanced than the public-facing conclusion.
That's what the report implies. It definitely questions how open and unbiased those early discussions really were.
It highlights that the initial consensus towards a natural origin might have had, other factors influencing it, beyond just the raw data.
Which leads right into gain-of-function research.
Yep, the GOF term.
The report defines it, changing a pathogen to give it new nullabilities. But it makes a distinction between general gain-of-function and this enhanced PPP.
Potential pandemic pathogen research, right? Aimed specifically at making things more transmissible or dangerous.
Exactly. And the big question becomes, did NIH-funded research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, through that EcoHealth Alliance grant, did that cross the line into enhanced PPP?
That's the core of the controversy, whether the specific experiments could have increased pandemic risk.
The report also mentions the diffuse proposal, something DARPA turned down.
Right. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency rejected it, citing biosecurity risks. So concerns about this kind of research weren't new.
And it sounds like the oversight of this research maybe wasn't great.
The report is pretty critical there. It finds NIH and NIAID failed to adequately oversee the EcoHealth grant.
And there's that mention of Dr. Fauci's testimony.
Yeah, that he often signed off on grants without reviewing the specifics. That definitely raises accountability questions.
Suggests a potential gap in oversight at the highest levels.
And the grant was eventually terminated, but the report says that decision came from the White House, Mark Meadows specifically.
Not necessarily NIH acting on its own initiative?
Correct. It implies White House intervention was needed due to concerns about the Wuhan lab. A potential disconnect there.
Okay, stepping away from the virology for a sec. The report also tackles the massive fraud in the pandemic relief programs.
Oh yeah, PPP, unemployment.
Billions, right. Links to organized crime even. And the report suggests federal agencies just weren't prepared to stop it, not enough safeguards. Data sharing wasn't there.
A huge vulnerability. The speed of rolling out the money created opportunities for fraud.
The Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, PRAC, they tried to track it afterwards.
Yeah, highlighting the need for a much stronger oversight in any big government spending, especially in a crisis.
Shifting globally now, the World Health Organization, the WHO.
They get some criticism in the report.
Quite a bit, especially about those early statements downplaying human-to-human spread, and the delays in declaring the public health emergency and then the pandemic itself.
Timing was crucial then.
The report also raises concerns about potential influence from the Chinese Communist Party on the WHO's actions and what info got shared.
Geopolitics impacting a global health body.
Yeah. And even the WHO's own origins study gets criticized for the team composition and its conclusions.
So questions about accuracy, timeliness, and impartiality regarding the WHO's early response.
Now for a really contentious one back home, mask mandates.
Always a flashpoint.
The report tracks the changing CDC guidance, statements from Dr. Fauci, and it points to times when the scientific justification seemed, maybe a bit shaky or stretched.
What examples does it give?
It mentions studies often cited to support mandates, like one about Missouri hairstylists, another in Arizona schools, but says they had major methodological flaws. They couldn't really prove what people claimed they proved.
So weak evidence being used for strong policies.
That's the suggestion. And then it brings up the Cochrane Review.
Which was much more skeptical about mask effectiveness against respiratory viruses, right?
Exactly. It suggests the science underpinning the broad mask guidance wasn't nearly as solid as it was often portrayed.
Illustrates the difficulty of making policy when the science is still developing and the risk of overstating the certainty.
And from mask mandates to vaccine mandates, another huge one.
Unprecedented scale for adults, really.
Yeah, requirements to work, travel, vaccine passports, different rules based on status. The report summarizes arguments that these were seen by many as punitive, discriminatory,
And damaging to public trust.
hugely damaging, according to the report, trust in vaccines, trust in government, and making political polarization worse.
It mentions a BMJ paper highlighting those unintended consequences, too.
It does. And even though federal mandates from OSHA, CMS, Head Start were eventually blocked or rescinded, the report argues they left a lasting negative impact.
So deep social and ethical questions raised about individual liberty versus collective health and the potential for mandates to backfire by eroding trust.
Okay, what about natural immunity? The idea that having had COVID gives you protection.
That was another big debate.
The report presents evidence suggesting prior infection did provide significant protection. It cites studies from Italy, Qatar.
Showing strong protection against reinfection or severe disease.
Yeah. And a Lancet study is mentioned, suggesting natural immunity was roughly comparable to 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine.
So substantial protection.
But interestingly, the report also talks about the Great Barrington Declaration. Remember that. It advocated a different strategy, focused protection.
I do. It was quite controversial.
Well, the report alleges it was actively suppressed. Coordinated efforts by NIH officials, media outlets to shut down that perspective.
Which raises questions about whether all scientific viewpoints got a fair hearing during the crisis.
Definitely suggests a chilling effect on open discourse.
Okay, back to the vaccines themselves. The booster push.
Right. The Biden administration pushing hard for boosters for all adults.
Even when some FDA experts had doubts.
Exactly. The report names Dr. Gruber and Dr. Krauss, top FDA vaccine officials, who were apparently concerned about the lack of solid data for boosting younger, healthy people at that time.
Internal dissent at the FDA.
Yeah. It mentions a meeting of the VRB-PAG, the FDA's advisory panel, where they initially voted against recommending broad boosters.
The FDA authorized them anyway.
They issued an amended emergency use authorization, yes. The report also touches on the difference between that EUA standard may be effective and the full approval, the BLA, which requires proof of safety and effectiveness.
Right, a higher bar for the BLA.
And the report suggests the review process for Pfizer's BLA was incredibly fast. There was apparently significant pressure to meet earlier and earlier deadlines.
Potentially compromising the thoroughness of the review.
That's the concern raised. Was it influenced by the desire to support vaccine mandates, which often relied on full approval? And it notes that Gruber and Krauss actually left the FDA over these concerns about the pace.
Their departures were quite high profile. It underscores that tension between political goals and the scientific review process within the regulatory agency.
Okay, let's circle back quickly to VAERS, the adverse event system.
Still highlighting its limits.
Yeah, insufficient, not fully transparent. And then it talks about the CICP, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program.
That's the program for people claiming injury from the COVID vaccines since they were covered under the Pre-P Act, right?
Exactly. And the report points to a huge backlog of claims, very slow processing times.
So people seeking compensation faced long delays.
It sounds like it. There was an effort mentioned to create an injury table for COVID vaccines to maybe speed things up, but the system was clearly struggling.
Making it difficult for those who believe they were injured to get timely relief.
And the report loops back to informed consent here, too.
Also,
Just reminding us that for EUA products, like the vaccines initially were, formal informed consent wasn't technically required.
an important point about balancing emergency response with individual rights.
Chairman Wenstrup even shares a personal story questioning why he needed a booster after having COVID and having high antibody levels.
Highlighting that disconnect between broad recommendations and individual circumstances.
Okay, zooming out again to economics, but more specific impacts this time.
On specific communities.
Yeah, rural areas, low-income communities, small businesses. The report says they were hit particularly hard, less access to capital, fewer job alternatives if their sector shut down.
Makes sense. Less cushion to absorb the shock.
And supply chain disruptions absolutely hammered small and medium businesses, forced closures.
A cascading effect.
Yeah.
The report mentions some relief programs like PPP, EIDL, TFAP.
Right. It acknowledges those existed, but still emphasizes the disproportionate pain felt in those specific communities and sectors.
A very uneven economic impact.
Now, let's talk about some of those other controversial public health measures. 6-foot social distancing. Stay-at-home orders.
Measures that affected everyone's daily life profoundly.
The report notes testimony from Dr. Collins himself admitting that, well, there wasn't really any science behind the 6-foot rule when it first appeared.
Seriously, no scientific basis cited at the time.
That's what the testimony suggests. And it brings up the Great Barrington Declaration suppression again.
And Collins's later reflection.
Yeah, acknowledging in retrospect that the downstream impacts mental health, economy, education of the aggressive policies weren't adequately considered.
A significant admission. Questioning the scientific grounding and the cost-benefit analysis of some major interventions.
What about schools? The role of teacher unions in closures.
Another very heated topic.
The report explains how unions, particularly the AFT and Randy Weingarten, advocated strongly for delayed reopenings and strict mitigation, often resisting reopening plans.
Citing safety concerns, presumably?
Yes, but the report claims they sometimes used flawed studies to back up their positions on masks, distancing, etc. It even gives examples where the AFT allegedly pressured the CDC to put specific school closure triggers into reopening guidance.
And did the CDC adopt them?
No, the report says the CDC didn't because the scientific evidence didn't support those specific triggers. It also mentions AFT proposing edits to CDC guidance that weren't necessarily science-based.
So it suggests union advocacy played a significant role, sometimes potentially at odds with the prevailing scientific guidance, in keeping schools closed or under strict measures.
That's the picture painted. That factors beyond just public health data influenced those decisions.
A complex interplay of health, politics, and labor concerns.
Finally, the report gets into something else. Alleged obstruction of the investigation itself.
Obstruction of the select subcommittee that produced this report.
Yeah. It talks about HHS issuing authorization letters that apparently limited what employees like Dr. Morans could discuss, made it harder to get information.
Restricting access.
That's the claim. It also mentions EcoHealth Alliance and Dr. Daszak focusing on minimizing damage to their organization rather than fully cooperating.
Not being fully forthcoming.
And specific instances are cited. Dr. Krish initially wanting to delete records, Dr. Morans using personal email to try and avoid FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act.
Trying to keep communications out of public view.
And then there's the whole situation with the Cuomo administration in New York. Allegations of a cover-up regarding nursing home deaths linked to that March 25th directive.
Altering data.
Yeah.
Claiming alignment with federal guidance when maybe it wasn't.
Exactly. Withholding documents, citing various privileges, even alleges Mr. Cuomo tried to influence testimony.
Wow. So across different areas, the report alleges significant resistance to transparency and oversight.
That's definitely a major theme in this final section. Serious concerns about accountability.
Okay. Lots to process.
It really is. So, wrapping up this deep dive into the SSCP report, it's obvious it raises some massive questions, from vaccine decisions, safety signals, the economic fallout.
The whole origins debate, the response of our institutions.
Yeah, it really drills down on issues of trust in leadership, the integrity of the scientific process, and that constant balancing act between public health measures and, well, individual liberties.
Absolutely. This report offers one very detailed perspective on the pandemic response. It's crucial to remember it is a perspective, but it definitely highlights the immense complexities we faced.
And the very different views on how things were handled.
It certainly prompts a critical look at what worked, what didn't, and the lessons learned, or maybe still needing to be learned for the next time.
So, thinking about everything we've just run through, what's maybe the one area of the pandemic response that you think most needs a really critical reevaluation to make sure we actually do better in a future crisis?
That's a tough one. Definitely gives you something to chew on.
For sure. And hey, if this has sparked your interest and you want to go even deeper, we absolutely encourage checking out the full report itself or related resources. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps.